And now we're going to talk about monitoring and oversight, what's good information. We had a couple sidebar conversations related to some things in the first session on basic roles and responsibilities. Anybody want to raise a comment or question related to that before we get started on the monitoring and oversight? If you think about it as we go along, don't hesitate to skip back to that other topic, and they indeed are interrelated. Just a general comment that may be of interest to you all. So AGB estimates now, I didn't know this till I started working with them, that there are about 50,000 people across the country who are on boards of post-secondary degree granting institutions, you know, from occupationally oriented two-year associate degree institutions to the R1s in both the public and private sector. So it's a huge number of people. I think about, of those 50,000, I think the institutions that are members of AGB comprise about 36,000 trustees. So we have a little project going that I wanted to mention to you called the Guardians Initiative, and the idea there is, in the face of all of the negative narrative about higher education that's out there these days, doubting the value proposition of it, are there some roles that trustees could play in public advocating more generally, not just for their institution, but in addition to that, for the value of higher education to individuals and to the society? So we've developed at AGB a bunch of resources and tools. I won't get into the detail now to help trustees do that. We work with the presidents and chancellors carefully to say who on your board do you think might be interested in doing this and be good at doing this. And again, given your roles, you know, you're on these boards because you're important people, not to swell your heads, but you get there because the governor or the electorate, if you're elected, recognizes that you've got talents and you've demonstrated your value to the state, to the society, to the community, to your profession. And you all have networks, and people listen to you generally in those networks. So if we have people like that who are out there who can talk knowledgeably about the value of higher education to the country, to the state of Texas in this case, we'll all be better off in the long run. So if folks want more information about that Guardians Initiative, just talk to me after we're done here, and we can get that for you. So let's start with a cartoon. This is Dilbert. I'm sure many of you will recognize Dilbert. So this is the what I'll call the no trolls approach to information sharing we'll talk about, a la Dilbert. So Dilbert over there on the left panel says, in order to make an informed decision, you'd need to know as much as I know. Middle panel, that's impossible. So instead, by mutual implied agreement, I love that, mutual implied agreement, I'm not quite sure what that means, but Dilbert says, by mutual implied agreement, I will feed you some lies that point you to the right decision. If we don't upgrade our servers, a herd of trolls will attack headquarters. No trolls, no trolls, we have to upgrade those servers. So this is a little bit of a way of getting into helping you think about what your board's decision-making process is or should be with your president or chancellor. And I think often there's not enough thought given to the methodology of how you reach these important decisions that you do. And I hope in this session we can think together about that a little bit and get somewhere that's useful. For my money, I'd say that the basic elements of a solid board decision-making process are that the board needs to be involved in three things. One, framing the issues and the questions about them, helping to do that. Two, deciding what facts it needs to answer the questions. And three, ensuring it has several options to choose among to decide on the best answer for the institution or system. And all of those things need to be done, again, in cooperation with your president or chancellor and his or her senior staff. But framing those questions, deciding the facts and the data, the information you need to answer the question, and then ensuring that you've got several different ways to answer it in the best interest of the institution makes a lot of sense. there's a publication called Consequential Boards, and you've got an excerpt from it actually in your packet this morning that AGB put out a couple of years ago. And I won't go into detail here other than to say this is really about an ongoing issue that we still have of in higher education generally, not having really great shared frameworks for looking at costs, revenues, how they interact, unit costs, all that good stuff. Individual institutions, I think, can have that. Systems can have that, but we're still at a point where that is differently gated in some instances from one institution to another, from one system to another, from one state to another. So it makes it difficult to talk across the entire enterprise of American higher education. And that makes it a little more difficult sometimes for board members to do their jobs well. Another thing that this publication said was too much board time and attention goes to perfunctory review, routine report outs at the expense of strategic focus on cross-cutting issues and other big topics that receive inadequate attention. So I'd say here, you always want to be struggling for a sweet spot on this issue of how much information you need. And that's between being, on the one hand, overwhelmed by so many factoids, so many pieces of information that it's just not clear. You can't possibly sort it all out, and I've seen that happen with boards. And on the other hand, you don't want to fall into what I'll call the Arabian Peninsula climate conundrum. That's where you conclude that the Arabian Peninsula has a moderate climate because somebody says, well, the average temperature is 50 degrees. Sounds pretty moderate. But what they don't tell you is it can be 0 at night and climb to 100 during the day, and probably does on a regular basis. So it's not really a moderate climate, but you get that one uber statistic, that one datum, and you think, oh, moderate climate. So how you avoid that on the one hand and getting so much data that the fire hose overwhelms you is a trick. So I think what you want working with your CEO is accurate information expressed understandably without oversimplification on the one hand, but without this fire hose effect on the other. And finding that sweet spot is not easy. I mean, I always felt every region meeting, we on the staff were struggling with that. The board chair and I would struggle with that. How much on this information do people, on this issue, how much information do people need and want to make the decision we're asking the board to make? Ongoing work. This talks about benchmarking performance, and one of the problems with not having all the data arrayed in a way you need it is it's harder to benchmark performance than it needs to be. And I think another issue that often comes up is, well, who are our peers for any one institution or any one system? Who should we compare ourselves with? So when we, in Wisconsin, put that growth agenda together that Fred mentioned when he initially introduced me, we had meetings with the chancellors of each campus. In Wisconsin, the chancellors are the campus CEOs, the president is the system CEO. So I met with the chancellors and their leadership teams, and we had, in the system office, produced packets of information on institutions that had similar missions, similar resources, similar student bodies, similar histories, and said, well, we think these are really the peers, and there are 3 here that are doing better than you are at the University of Wisconsin X in terms of retention and graduation rates. There are 3 others who are doing worse, but let's try and figure out together what the 3 who are doing better are doing, because they're an awful lot like you, and they must have found some ways to operate that help them graduate more students in shorter period of time. So it's about getting the right data, but then using it for comparative purposes to benchmark yourself against peer institutions or systems. So with that introduction, we'll talk a little bit about what you should know and why. And let me say, there's an awful lot of stuff here. There's too much. in a way. It's not that every one of these things I'll mention you as a board member need to have fully in mind all the time. You couldn't possibly do it. Over time, they're all things that the board needs to be paying attention to, but we'll talk about ways to zero in as we go along. Let's start with the why part of this, though. So you are all representatives of the people of Texas, whether you're a board member or a chancellor or a president, really. And these are some things that I think the people of Texas might expect you to know, be able to do. Make sure the dollars in your institution or system are spent effectively and efficiently. This is kind of the prudent man or woman charge to anybody on a board, a basic fiduciary responsibility. Watch debt closely on behalf of the taxpayers and your students. There's institutional debt and there's student debt. And you know the immense attention that student debt has been getting in the media, and usually it's about somebody who's gone to a private institution or two with a very high tuition, made some bad choices and switches, and is $100,000 in debt and working as a barista at the coffee shop and living in his or her parents' basement. You know, that's the person that the media likes to write about on the student debt issue. It's a very small minority of our graduates, but it's still a significant issue that you really need to be aware of in the interests of your students and their success post-graduation from your institution. Some other things to be aware of. Make sure the physical facilities are maintained and new ones are built when needed. And Tom Keaton talked a little bit about how you all are analyzing this at the Higher Ed Coordinating Board, the use of those facilities. One of the questions you may hear coming up in this regard is, well, look, we're doing more and more online, aren't we? We're doing more and more internships and cooperative education experiences. So not everybody is on campus as much as they used to be, are they? Do we need to keep building these facilities at the rate we have been in the past? I mean, that's a dialogue that you all will probably be entering into at some point if you haven't already. And then there is on the other hand, on facilities, what I'll call the co-opetition factor, right? All your public institutions should be cooperating with each other, but at another level, they're competitive with each other, many of them. They're competing for, if you're in business terms, for clients in the same market, right? So, and that's not all bad. It's not all bad to have some competitive juices flowing that pushes people hopefully to higher levels of success in their institutions. But I've had the experience, and maybe some of you had, of people who would complain to me about, why is tuition so high? Why do we have, when I went to college, I lived in a 2x4 room with a bunk bed and a metal locker, and now everybody's got suites, and they have European food menus, and they have lazy rivers, and they have rock climbing walls. Why do all these students need it? And then you talk to that same person who's just returned from 3 visits with his daughter, who's a senior in high school, and I say, oh, she loved that place with the rock climbing wall, the European menu, the lazy river. She's going there. And I liked it too. So, I mean, there is that dialogue that's going on now that you have to decide how to manage with your chief executive officer. And it does have implications for your capital budget, obviously. Make sure the employees are cared for. In any business and any organization, the success or failure is dependent in very large part on the people who work at the institution or the organization. And a thing for board members to be aware of is that many of our employees in universities, not all of them, but many of them, are in national or indeed international markets. That is, they can go and get hired somewhere in New York or Wisconsin or California at another university if they have an attractive portfolio that they built as a faculty member. And you need to be worried about how do we attract and hold the best possible faculty and staff that we can have at our institution or system. And the other thing I'd say to you is that faculty and staff will scrutinize everything you say or do as a board member to figure out, how is this affecting me? Or how is it going to affect me and my colleagues in my department, in my school, in my discipline? They will overanalyze that, in my experience, but that will happen. So every arched eyebrow by a board member or the president in these days, when very many of us are streaming live the meetings, will be interpreted. 99% of the time, misinterpreted, but it will be interpreted, and you need to be thinking about that relationship to the employees and its importance for your institution. Be sure the academic programs for the students are of the highest quality the institution can afford. And be sure the institution deals with suggestions from the accrediting bodies and have assurance that students are provided the assistance necessary to complete their education as soon as possible. On the quality issue, I think a thing we don't talk enough about is the definition of quality. So think about this. You've got an 18-year-old student who wants to come to the University of Texas at Austin, be a residential student, be involved in student government, go to the football games, major in history with a minor in Spanish, and take advantage of all of the wonderful things that campus offers to a residential student who's 18 years old. Second student is a 26-year-old guy, has a high school diploma. He's been kicking around since he's been out of high school for, 8 years or something in that case. And he's decided now he wants to go back and get an associate program in computer science that relates to the video game industry. Wants to work in the video game industry. He's got a job now, but he wants to go back and get that degree. Third person is a 38-year-old single mother with a mortgage, a cat, a dog, 2 children, and a job somewhere in rural Texas. And she needs 20 more credits to complete a baccalaureate degree in business so she can go up in the ranks of her company, her profession, where she needs a baccalaureate degree to do it. Interesting question. Is quality, the definition of quality, the same for those 3 students, or is it different? And part of the problem for a lot of us of a certain age who are on boards is we all default to our experience as undergraduates, many of us full residential kind of experience at some point or another. You know, when I was in college, we had 6 million American undergraduates. We now have 19 or 20 million American undergraduates. We tripled the size of the operation, and there are all of these different wants, needs, and expectations that these many different kinds of students have of us. How should we be defining quality for those different students depending on the nature and mission of your institution? And we don't have the community college people in the room here, but we have to think very broadly about the whole enterprise in that regard when it comes to quality. We already have talked about accrediting bodies, completing their education, as soon as possible, ways to encourage and enable students to do that is really important with the cost of education now, and the board needs to attend to that, I'd argue. I was always amazed at when we proposed a tuition increase of $250 a year, and you'd get all of the outrage that you're raising tuition. And I'd say, well, look, if we could get our students to stay for 4 years and complete a degree instead of 6, they'd save $30,000. At UW-Madison, then it would cost about $15,000 a year for tuition, room, and board. So if you stayed for a 5th year, you spent $15,000 more than if you did it in 4 years. If you stayed for 6 years, you spent $30,000 more. But, and people would do that on a regular basis. But the $250 tuition increase was like, oh my God, this is terrible. So we need to think about completion, both in terms of academic quality, but certainly in terms of what people are spending on student debt. Be comfortable your students are safe and live in a healthy environment. People of Texas have a right to believe that's the case when they send their sons and daughters to your institutions or when they go themselves as adult students. And you could say, okay, that's the least thing we can do, and in a way that's true. Although when I think now of a safe environment, I can't help but my mind going to the huge controversy and strain over sexual assault on campuses, lack of safety in that regard. And you know, I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of seasoned presidents and chancellors who have said to me, boy, this is one I really don't know how to handle. You know, this is kind of above my pay grade. This is a really tough, complicated issue, and we're going back and forth with the federal government on it and elected officials. So again, in terms of hot button issues you all may confront as board members, that one of sexual assault is one of the hottest ones on campus right now, I would say. Strategic plan has one and is being followed. Again, that's about tracking metrics and make sure your institution is making progress toward its share of the big goal in your 60 by 30 plan. And I think this is really important for the whole country, and Texas being a big part of the whole country, it's really important in Texas. You know, about 15 or 20 years ago, the United States had the largest proportion of its adult population with a college degree or post-secondary degree, let's call it, of any country in the world. We're now, the last time I looked, we're down to about 14th in the international rankings. There are 13 or 14 countries whose populations now have a higher percentage of college degree holders than ours does. This is not a trend we can abide and expect in the long run to be competitive in a global knowledge economy. We've got to do a better job at having more of our students get into college but complete. And your plan, you know, is the coordinating board's plan is focused on that, and I know you've been working hard at it for a number of years now, and I'd urge you just to keep at it. Well, let's move to what you should know, and this really is about good data, what it can do if it's accurate and consistent. You know, it builds trust between the board and the president and chancellor and his or her staff, between the institution and the outside world. It really is an essential management tool. It makes the board's decisions much more credible if you can say, people have their opinions on whether we need a new veterinary school, which we're talking about or not, but here are the facts about large animal care in Texas. Here's what we know. Here's what we know about docs in rural areas in Texas. People doctors, not, you know, those kinds of facts are essential, and boards need to make their decisions based on good facts. It also lets you respond quickly. If you know you have databases that are accurate and relatively comprehensive, then you're not in a situation where bad news hits and it takes you 3 days to say anything about it, or even worse, a board member or the president feels they have to say something and they get out there and they say something that's not very grounded in the facts and then have to retract it on the second day. So really important in that regard when the news cycle is so intense, so intrusive, and so fast. It also lets you obviously follow trend lines and make those peer comparisons, and will stimulate good questions. Again, I think in many ways the most important thing board members can do is ask good questions of the people running the institutions and talk about what they think the right answers are. But don't ignore the subjective. I mean, you can, going back to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula thing, think you have very sharp numbers, but you get the story wrong finally. And Senator Moynihan from New York, who many of you will remember, used to like to say, data is the plural of anecdote. So those all, they relate to each other. What you make of the data you see is really something to think about. What different interpretations might a board have of this same data, and how should we interpret it now at our institution with the help of our president? Another interesting quote, there's a guy by the name of Richard Chait, he's now retired, who was a professor in the ed school at Harvard, who spent his career really studying board behavior in higher education, both public and private. And he used to say there are three great things that board members can bring to institutions of higher education, and they're sequential. So the first is oversight. You know, part of your role, obviously, is as overseers of our institutions. And that oversight, to be accurate, effective, needs to be grounded in good data, good numbers, good information. But if you're doing that after a while on a board, you can start to really provide some insight about how that institution is using the data, where it needs to go. And then when you get even more experience as a board member, you can bring the gift of foresight to the institution based on the insight and the oversight and the insight, getting to that point where you can help the president and chancellor look around the corners, see over the next hill as to what the challenges and opportunities are for that institution. But it all starts at having good data and performing oversight on it, but then going on to insight and foresight. So what are some of the things you should know? And I'll throw out a whole bunch of these. Compared to peers, the cost by category per 100 FTE, and 100 is just a nice round number we can use here for comparison. And by category there, I mean lower division undergrad, upper division undergrad, master's level, and doctoral level. And you saw some of the differences in your funding formula on that when Mary Knight went through it earlier. Compared to peers, the administrative staffing per 100 FTE students. You know, often institutions are accused of having administrative bloat, right? We have too many administrators, we're paying out all these high salaries to people. One of the interesting discussions a board should have on that second bullet, I think, is, well, who's counted as an administrator as you categorize people at the institution? Does that count all the non-instructional staff? Are they all lumped into one category of administration? And if it is, you know, that includes people like academic advisors, psychologists in the counseling center, police officers on campus, groundskeepers, and that's usually not, some of those people anyway, are not what people mean when they criticize administrators, right? So we need to be careful about how we're defining those categories when we make those comparisons. Real cost of athletics, and there was a question earlier today to Mary about that, you know, is your athletic program giving money back to the institution in some way, or is the institution subsidizing the athletic program, going the other direction? Even when the athletic program is making money and maybe giving some money back to the core operation, what about its administrative overhead? You know, who pays for the buildings the basketball team plays in? Who pays for the heat and light in those buildings when they need to have heat and light in them? Is that part of the athletic department budget? Is it part of the university budget generally? Those kinds of questions are good to know with all the focus on athletics. Compared to peers, the staffing ratio per 100 FTEs by institutional category. That is, what's the staffing in community colleges in the state? What's the staffing in four-year and master's campuses in the state? What's the staffing in research universities? And how does your institution or system compare to the others? Compared to peers, income from tuition and fees per 100 FTE students. Behind that is a question of what's your pricing philosophy and policy. Hopefully the policy reflects that philosophy you have on pricing. And this goes to what your mission is, who your student body is, what the relative levels of wealth they come from and don't come from. All of those things are important to fit into that conversation of comparative tuition and fees. Average salaries for faculty and staff, we already talked about that, compared to peers. Financial health, living within budget, and all those categories for spending, debt load, reserves, et cetera. We had quite a little controversy in Wisconsin a couple years ago when I was president over the level of reserves. Some people thought we had too much. So an interesting question to ask is, well, reserves do we have at this institution? Is it the right amount? Is it too much? Is it too little? How do you determine whether it's too much or too little? How does what you have in reserves relate to your tuition decision every year? How does it relate to your capital budget? Do you have plans to use those reserves in certain ways? Are they in a checking account just waiting to be spent on a building that you know will start being built 6 months from now? Or is it more general emergency money and what if we need a new roof kind of money? And you need to have some of that if you're going to be responsible as an institutional president, as a board of governors as well. Audit reports, people already talked about that. Need to have competent and faithful audit activities going on that you have confidence in, and members of the board, whether you have an audit committee or it's done in another way, involved in looking at those audits and talking to the full board then about how those members of the board see those audits. What story are those audits telling? Where are their potential problems? Where are their current problems? Where are their glories that need to be imitated? So always an important function for boards' fiduciary responsibilities. Activities that boost economic development in the state and region. Again, I think more and more universities are being looked to do this, especially public universities, especially in a knowledge economy. The local elected officials, local appointed officials, local businesses want the institution to be interacting with them in ways that help build the economic strength of that region and indeed the state as a whole. So knowing about what your institution is doing in that regard is a good thing for trustees to know. And often, there are great things going on in this count that people don't know about. So this can often be a feel-good story or two for you to have in your mind as governing board members when that person comes up in the grocery store on Saturday morning and complains about the tuition hike you just approved, to say, well, but wait a minute, have you heard what we're doing with company X to help retrain their employees so they can deal more effectively with advanced manufacturing technology that's new from the old manufacturing that used to be done. Success of private fundraising, again, that's become much more important in the public sector of higher ed than it ever was before, and boards of trustees need to therefore pay attention to it. It has all sorts of interesting implications. We were talking a little scrum group here about the donor who gets mad at something that's gone on the campus and withdraws the gift for the new building that was going to help. I mean, it's got all sorts of interesting political dynamics. Another thing that started to happen that is good on this count, I think, is more and more people who are major donors are willing to consider donating for a need-based financial aid for students. And there is a great need for need-based financial aid still. And in the past, very often, private donors were, oh, we want a building. We want our name on a building. There's still a lot of that. We want a scholarship for left-handed violin players from the high school I went to go to the University of Houston Clear Lake. That's what I'm going to fund. I'll give you an endowment for that. The more we can talk to people about the need for need-based financial aid, the better. Well, are you exhausted yet on all these? What happens to your graduates? More focus on this these days, right? What are your job placement rates? How successful are they after they get into a job? How about professional school, graduate school acceptance rates? The viability of academic programs and centers. Do you have a way to sort of know the success of the academic programs that your institution offers? How much, Mary? 5 minutes remaining. Do you ask questions about that? Do you once a year get a report on, well, here are the academic programs that we've dropped or cut back. Here are the ones that you have approved over the course of the year and how they relate to each other. Again, accreditation findings we've talked about, performance evaluation process, and that really is about all employees going through a performance evaluation project. National licensure exams, important. They're public numbers that people use to compare you to others. The quality of incoming freshmen. And really that goes to a good knowledge, feel for the standards you have for admissions and the policy and the standards and how they're applied. And again, this will be different depending on the different missions of different institutions, as it should be. Transfer rates and success of transfers. This is a way things are very different in higher ed now from the way they used to be when many of us went to university. Right now, more than 50% of the people in this country who earn a baccalaureate degree have credits from more than one institution. More than 50%, and that number continues to rise. And not surprising, right? Because now, for instance, with online education, a student can say, oh, I'm going to take that online course from here while I'm enrolled there. And while I'm home, I'm going to take this course over the summer at this two-year campus and then apply it back. And this is only going to continue. It's student swirl is what some people have called it, students swirling among institutions. It's not true of all students at all institutions, but it is a phenomenon that's out there, and transfer rates are important for you to know. Diversity of the student population and the faculty and staff. So what we know about this is that we will not as a country, you will not as a state, get to the numbers that you've set out of degree completers unless we do a better job with a more diverse student body. And part of doing a better job with a more diverse student body is having faculty and staff who look like and can relate to that more diverse student body. So that's important to know too. You know what? I'm going to, because we're running out of time, again, this is all on the thumb drive, and I won't go through all of these, and this is kind of how you can get started in asking about some of this. And I think one last concept, and then we'll open it up. The idea of a dashboard of indicators, of data, of information is a good one, because there's so much that you could be looking at that you need to know something about. But the most important things that you feel you need regular knowledge of, you need to be tracking with your chief executive on a regular basis, are the ones that are good to go in to a dashboard that's a select number of indicators of metrics that you look at on a very regular basis, because otherwise there are so many balls in the air that you just lose track of them. Okay, I'm going to stop there and see what questions, comments, reactions we have. No time. Ah, sorry. We didn't plan it that way, but that's the way it worked. Thank you.